The contract lay torn in half on the rough wooden table, its edges still sharp from Daniel Thompson's weathered hands. Diane Ross stared at the fragments of paper that had bound her fate for 3 months, her breath catching in her throat as she watched the mountain man's calloused fingers sweep the pieces into the crackling fire. The flames consumed the document hungrily, orange light dancing across his bearded face as he turned to meet her wide, disbelieving eyes. "You're free now," he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of mountains and the promise of something she had almost forgotten existed. But freedom was a word Diane had learned to fear, for it had been taken from her so swiftly before. 3 months earlier, she had stood in her father's cramped parlor in the valley town of Cedar Falls, watching Mark Stewart count out bills with the methodical precision of a man who had done this transaction many times before. Her father, Wayne Peterson, sat hunched in his chair, his hands trembling, not from age but from the shame that had eaten away at him like a slow poison. "She's 18, healthy, and knows her way around a kitchen," Wayne had said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The debt is $400 plus interest." Mark Stewart had looked up from his counting, his pale eyes settling on Diane with the calculating gaze of a man appraising livestock. "The contract states 3 years of service. No wages, but room and board provided. She'll work in my establishment in Copper Ridge, serving drinks and keeping the men company." The words had hit Diane like physical blows. She had known her father's gambling had grown worse since her mother's death 2 years prior, but she had never imagined it would come to this. The poker games that stretched late into the night, the horse races where he bet money they didn't have, the dice games behind Murphy's saloon where desperate men wagered their last coins on luck that never came. "Papa, please," she had whispered, but Wayne Peterson could not meet his daughter's eyes. "It's done," Mark Stewart had said, sliding the contract across the table. "Sign here, girl. Your father's debts die with this agreement, and you'll have work and shelter. Better than what you'd find on your own." Diane's hand had shaken as she picked up the pen, her mind racing through the few alternatives available to an unmarried woman in a town where opportunities were as scarce as honest men. She could work as a seamstress for pennies a day, barely enough to keep herself fed. She could try to find work as a housekeeper, though respectable families rarely hired young women without references. Or she could sign the contract and hope that whatever awaited her in Copper Ridge would be survivable. The ink had dried on her signature before she fully understood what she had agreed to. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. The journey to Copper Ridge had taken 2 days by wagon, winding through mountain passes where the air grew thin and cold. Mark Stewart had said little during the trip, his attention focused on the treacherous road ahead. Diane had wrapped herself in her mother's old shawl and tried not to think about what lay waiting for her in the mining town nestled high in the Colorado Rockies. Copper Ridge had been everything she feared, and worse. The town existed solely to serve the copper mine that carved its way deep into the mountain's heart. And the men who worked those dark tunnels emerged each evening hungry for whiskey, gambling, and whatever comfort they could buy with their hard-earned wages. Mark Stewart's establishment, the Silver Dollar, sat at the heart of the town's main street, its painted facade hiding the desperation that festered within its walls. "You'll serve drinks, keep the tables clean, and smile pretty for the customers," Mark had told her on her first night. "The girls upstairs handle other business, but that's not required of you. Not unless you choose it." The words had carried an implicit threat that made Diane's skin crawl. She had learned quickly that in Copper Ridge, women had few choices and even fewer protections. The other girls who worked at the Silver Dollar moved through the saloon like ghosts, their eyes hollow and their smiles painted on with the same desperation that kept them coming back night after night. Hannah Clark had been the first to befriend her, a woman perhaps 5 years older whose auburn hair had lost its luster and whose laugh had a brittle edge that spoke of dreams long abandoned. "Keep your head down and your hands busy," Hannah had advised during Diane's first week. "Mark's not the worst of them, but he's not kind either. Do your work, save what little you can, and maybe someday you'll find a way out." But escape had seemed impossible. The contract bound Diane to 3 years of service, And Mark Stewart made sure she understood the consequences of breaking that agreement. The law in Copper Ridge favored men with money and influence, and a young woman with no family and no resources would find little sympathy from the local sheriff, Donald Hughes, who spent more time drinking at the Silver Dollar than enforcing justice. The work itself had been exhausting but bearable. Diane served whiskey and beer to miners whose faces were permanently stained with copper dust, their hands rough and their manners crude but not necessarily cruel. She learned to dodge grasping fingers and deflect unwanted advances with practiced ease, developing a shell of polite distance that protected her from the worst of their attention. But it was the nights that haunted her most. Lying in the small room she shared with Hannah above the saloon, listening to the sounds that drifted up through the thin floorboards, laughter that turned to shouting, the crash of breaking glass, the heavy footsteps of men who had drunk away their inhibitions and their humanity. Sometimes there were screams, quickly muffled, and Diane would pull her pillow over her head and try to pretend she was somewhere else, anywhere else. The mountain loomed over Copper Ridge like a sleeping giant, its peaks crowned with snow even in summer. Diane often found herself staring up at those distant heights during her brief moments of respite, wondering what lay beyond them. Freedom, perhaps, or at least the possibility of a different kind of life. But the mountain also represented danger, for the wilderness that surrounded Copper Ridge was unforgiving to those who ventured into it unprepared. It was during her second month at the Silver Dollar that Diane first saw Daniel Thompson. He had come down from the high country to trade furs and resupply, his pack laden with the pelts of animals most people only heard about in stories. He was a large man, broad-shouldered and bearded, with eyes the color of winter sky and hands that looked capable of breaking a man in half or crafting something beautiful with equal ease. Unlike the miners who frequented the Silver Dollar, Daniel carried himself with a quiet confidence that needed no bluster or boasting. He spoke little, conducting his business with Mark Stewart in low, measured tones before settling at a corner table with a single glass of whiskey that he nursed for hours while watching the room with those pale, intelligent eyes. "That's the mountain man," Hannah had whispered to Diane during a lull in the evening's chaos. "Lives up in the high country, comes down maybe 3 times a year. Some say he's been up there so long he's more wolf than man, but I've never seen him cause trouble for anyone." Diane had found herself stealing glances at Daniel Thompson throughout the evening, curious about a man who chose solitude over the company of others. There was something in his bearing that spoke of self-sufficiency and inner strength, qualities that seemed as foreign in Copper Ridge as fresh mountain air. When their eyes met across the crowded saloon, Diane felt a jolt of recognition, as if some part of her soul had been waiting for that moment without her knowing it. Daniel's gaze held hers for a long heartbeat before he looked away, but not before she caught something in his expression that might have been understanding, or perhaps pity. The encounter had lasted only seconds, but it planted a seed in Diane's mind that grew stronger with each passing day. Here was a man who had chosen his own path, who lived by his own rules in the vast wilderness that stretched beyond the mining town's narrow boundaries. If such a life was possible for him, might it be possible for others as well? But such thoughts were dangerous luxuries for a woman bound by contract and circumstance. Diane pushed them aside and focused on surviving each day, each night, each encounter with men whose eyes held promises she never wanted them to fulfill. She learned to make herself small and unremarkable, to blend into the background like smoke from the saloon's oil lamps. The turning point came during her third month in Copper Ridge, on a night when the autumn wind howled down from the peaks and rattled the windows of the Silver Dollar. A group of miners had been drinking heavily, celebrating a particularly rich vein of ore they had discovered deep in the mountain's belly. Their celebration had grown increasingly raucous as the evening wore on, their voices loud and their hands increasingly bold. One of them, a man named Stephen Peterson, whose reputation for violence preceded him like a shadow, had cornered Diane near the bar as she tried to clear empty glasses from a nearby table. His breath reeked of whiskey and tobacco, his eyes glazed with drink and something darker. "Pretty little thing like you shouldn't be wasting away in a place like this," he had slurred, his hand reaching out to touch her face. "I got a cabin up the mountain a ways, nice and private, could use some company for the winter." Diane had tried to step away, but Stephen's other hand shot out to grab her wrist, his fingers digging into her skin with bruising force. Now don't be shy, sweetheart. I'm offering you a real opportunity here. The saloon had grown quieter around them, other patrons sensing the shift in atmosphere, but unwilling to intervene. Mark Stewart was nowhere to be seen, likely counting the night's take in his office upstairs. Hannah caught Diane's eye from across the room, her face pale with worry. But there was little she could do against a man of Stephen's size and reputation. "Let me go," Diane had said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the fear that threatened to choke her. Stephen's grip had tightened instead, his face moving closer to hers. "I don't think you understand the situation here, girl. Your contract don't protect you from everything. And Mark Stewart ain't gonna risk his business over one serving girl." It was then that Daniel Thompson had risen from his corner table, his movements so smooth and quiet that few in the saloon noticed at first. But Stephen Peterson noticed, his head turning toward the mountain man with the wary alertness of a predator suddenly aware of a larger threat. "This ain't your concern, Thompson," Stephen had growled, but his grip on Diane's wrist had loosened slightly. Daniel had said nothing at first, simply moving closer with the unhurried gait of a man who had faced down grizzly bears and mountain lions and found them wanting. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Let her go." Two words spoken without heat or anger, but they carried more weight than all of Stephen Peterson's bluster and threats. The miner's eyes had darted around the room, looking for support from his companions, but found only averted gazes and studied indifference. Even drunk and belligerent, Stephen was smart enough to recognize that he was outmatched. "This ain't over," he had muttered, releasing Diane's wrist and stepping back. But his retreat had been swift, and within minutes he and his companions had stumbled out into the cold mountain night. Daniel had returned to his table without a word, settling back into his chair as if nothing had happened. But when Diane brought him a fresh glass of whiskey, her hands still trembling from the encounter, he had looked up at her with those winter sky eyes and nodded almost imperceptibly. "Thank you," she had whispered, and he had acknowledged her gratitude with another slight nod before returning his attention to the amber liquid in his glass. The incident had marked a turning point in Diane's time at the Silver Dollar. Word spread quickly through Copper Ridge's tight-knit community that the mountain man had taken an interest in protecting the contract girl, and other potential troublemakers found reasons to keep their distance. Mark Stewart had been furious when he learned what had happened. Not because one of his employees had been threatened, but because the confrontation had disrupted his business. "You stay away from that mountain man," he had warned Diane the next morning. "He's trouble, and I won't have him scaring off paying customers." But Daniel Thompson had already left Copper Ridge, disappearing back into the high country as quietly as he had come. Diane found herself watching the mountain trails for signs of his return, though she told herself it was merely curiosity about the man who had intervened on her behalf. The weeks that followed brought the first heavy snows of winter, transforming Copper Ridge into an isolated outpost surrounded by white wilderness. The mining operation slowed but never stopped, and the Silver Dollar remained busy as men sought warmth and companionship during the long, dark evenings. Diane continued her work, serving drinks and avoiding trouble, but something had changed within her. The seed of possibility that Daniel Thompson's intervention had planted had begun to grow, fed by dreams of a different kind of life. It was during one of these snowy nights that Mark Stewart had called her into his office, his face wearing the expression of a man who had made an unpleasant but profitable decision. Sitting across from his desk was a stranger, a well-dressed man with soft hands and calculating eyes, who introduced himself as Joyce Gutierrez, a businessman from Denver with interests in various enterprises throughout the territory. "Miss Ross," Mark had begun, his tone falsely cheerful, "Mr. Gutierrez here has made me an interesting proposition. He's looking to acquire your contract, and he's offered me a very generous sum." Diane's blood had turned to ice water in her veins. She had heard whispers about Joyce Gutierrez, about the houses he operated in Denver and other cities, about the girls who worked for him and were never seen again. The prospect of being sold to such a man made her previous situation seem almost tolerable by comparison. "The contract states 3 years of service," Joyce had said, his voice smooth as silk and twice as dangerous. I can offer better accommodations than this mountain saloon, more refined clientele, and opportunities for advancement for a girl with your particular qualities. The words were dressed up in pretty language, but their meaning was clear. Diane would be moved from serving drinks to serving men in ways that would destroy whatever remained of her dignity and self-respect. She had opened her mouth to protest, to beg, to offer any alternative when the door to Mark Stewart's office had burst open. Daniel Thompson stood in the doorway, snow still clinging to his coat and fury burning in his winter sky eyes. Behind him, Diane could see Martha Hill, the saloon's cook, wringing her hands with worry. She had clearly run to fetch the mountain man when she overheard the conversation taking place in Mark's office. "What's the meaning of this?" Mark had sputtered, but Daniel's attention was focused entirely on the contract that lay open on the desk between the two men. Without invitation, Daniel had stepped into the room and picked up the document, his eyes scanning its contents with the careful attention of a man who understood the weight of written words. Joyce Gutierrez had started to protest, but something in the mountain man's bearing had made him reconsider. "This contract is illegal," Daniel had said finally, his voice carrying the quiet certainty of absolute conviction. "Indentured servitude was outlawed in Colorado territory 5 years ago. Any agreement that binds a person to unpaid labor is void under territorial law." The room had fallen silent, except for the howling of wind outside and the crackling of the fire in Mark's small stove. Diane had stared at Daniel in amazement, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. Mark Stewart's face had gone pale, while Joyce Gutierrez had begun calculating the implications of this unexpected development. "You're mistaken, Thompson," Mark had said, but his voice lacked conviction. "This is a standard employment contract, nothing more." Daniel had held up the document, pointing to specific clauses with one weathered finger. "No wages specified, no right to terminate employment, binding for a fixed period regardless of circumstances. This is indentured servitude, pure and simple, and it's not worth the paper it's written on." It was then that Daniel had torn the contract in half, the sound of ripping paper echoing through the small office like a gunshot. Joyce Gutierrez had risen from his chair, his hand moving toward his coat, but Daniel's eyes had fixed on him with predatory intensity. "I'd think carefully about your next move, friend," the mountain man had said. "This is my territory, and I don't take kindly to men who trade in human misery." The confrontation had ended as quickly as it began. Joyce Gutierrez had gathered his coat and hat and departed into the snowy night without another word, clearly deciding that whatever profit he might have gained wasn't worth the risk of crossing Daniel Thompson. Mark Stewart had blustered and threatened, but his protests had rung hollow in the face of legal reality. And now Diane stood in the same office, watching the fragments of her contract burn in the fireplace, hardly able to believe that her nightmare was finally over. But even as relief flooded through her, a new fear began to take its place. She was free, yes, but free to do what? She had no money, no family to return to, and winter was tightening its grip on the high country. Daniel seemed to read her thoughts in her expression. "Pack your things," he said quietly. "You can't stay here, and you won't survive the winter on your own. My cabin has room for 2, and I could use help with the trap lines." The offer hung in the air between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Diane looked into his eyes and saw no deception, no hidden agenda, only a straightforward proposition from a man who understood what it meant to survive in unforgiving country. But before she could answer, the sound of hoofbeats echoed through the snowy streets outside, growing louder and more urgent with each passing second. Daniel's head turned toward the window, his body tensing with the alertness of a man who had learned to recognize danger by its approach. "That's more riders than this town usually sees in winter," he said, his hand moving instinctively toward the knife at his belt. "And they're riding hard." The hoofbeats stopped directly outside the Silver Dollar, followed by the sound of boots on wooden steps and voices raised in urgent conversation. Diane felt her newfound freedom slipping away like sand through her fingers as she realized that Joyce Gutierrez had not given up as easily as it had appeared. The office door burst open once again, but this time it was not salvation that entered. Sheriff Donald Hughes stood in the doorway, his badge gleaming in the firelight and his hand resting on the butt of his gun. Behind him crowded three men Diane didn't recognize, their faces hard and their intentions clear. Daniel Thompson, the sheriff said, his voice carrying official authority backed by the threat of violence. You're under arrest for destruction of private property and interference with lawful business. And Miss Ross, you're coming with us. Seems there's been some question about the legality of that contract, and certain interested parties want to discuss the matter further. Diane's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized the trap that had been laid for them. Joyce Gutierrez had not retreated. He had simply regrouped and returned with legal backing and armed men. The torn contract might be worthless, but that wouldn't stop determined men from creating new justifications for their actions. Daniel stepped protectively in front of Diane, his eyes never leaving the sheriff's face. On whose authority? He asked, his voice deadly calm. Judge Martha Hill issued the warrant an hour ago, Sheriff Hughes replied. Seems Mr. Gutierrez has friends in high places, and they don't appreciate mountain men interfering with legitimate business transactions. The irony was not lost on Diane that the same Martha Hill who had run to fetch Daniel was now being used as justification for his arrest. In a territory where justice was often determined by who had the most money and influence, even the law could be twisted to serve the interests of men like Joyce Gutierrez. As the armed men moved into the small office, their hands hovering near their weapons, Diane realized that her moment of freedom had been nothing more than a cruel illusion. The contract might be torn, but the forces that had created it remained as strong as ever. And now, both she and the man who had tried to help her faced consequences that could prove far worse than anything Mark Stewart had ever threatened. The mountain wind howled outside, as if the wilderness itself was crying out against the injustice unfolding in the cramped office above the Silver Dollar. And in that moment, as Sheriff Hughes stepped forward with iron shackles gleaming in his hands, Diane Ross understood that her real fight for freedom was only just beginning. The cold steel of the shackles bit into Daniel's wrists as Sheriff Hughes fastened them with practiced efficiency, the metallic click echoing through the small office like the closing of a tomb. Diane watched in horror as the mountain man who had torn up her contract was reduced to a prisoner, his powerful frame somehow diminished by the weight of false accusations and corrupt authority. The three men behind the sheriff kept their hands near their weapons, their eyes never leaving Daniel's face, as if they expected him to transform into the wild beast that rumors claimed he was. This is a mistake, Hughes, Mark Stewart said from behind his desk, though his voice carried more concern for his establishment's reputation than any genuine outrage at the injustice unfolding before him. Thompson was just causing trouble, nothing more. No need to involve judges and warrants. Sheriff Hughes turned his attention to the saloon owner, his expression cold and businesslike. The warrant's been issued, Mark. Judge Martha Hill was very clear about the charges: destruction of private property, interference with lawful commerce, and threatening behavior toward a legitimate businessman. He gestured toward the ashes in the fireplace where the contract had burned. That document was worth considerable money to Mr. Gutierrez, and Thompson destroyed it without legal authority. Diane felt the walls of the small office closing in around her as she realized the full scope of the trap that had been laid. Joyce Gutierrez had not simply retreated into the snowy night. He had used the time to orchestrate a response that would ensure his victory through legal channels. The mountain man's act of defiance had been transformed into criminal behavior through the manipulation of territorial law and the corruption of local officials. And what about Miss Ross? One of Gutierrez's men asked, his voice carrying the flat accent of someone from far outside the mountain territories. The arrangement with Mr. Stewart still needs to be honored. Daniel's head snapped up at these words, his winter sky eyes blazing with a fury that made even the armed men take an involuntary step backward. Despite the shackles that bound his hands, he radiated a dangerous energy that filled the cramped space like the charge before a lightning strike. She's not property to be bought and sold, he said, his voice carrying the quiet menace of an avalanche gathering momentum. That contract was illegal, and every man in this room knows it. Sheriff Hughes drew his pistol with deliberate slowness, the barrel catching the firelight as he pointed it at Daniel's chest. You're in no position to make legal arguments, Thompson. The judge has ruled and the law will be enforced. Miss Ross will come with us to answer questions about her contractual obligations. The words hit Diane like physical blows. each syllable driving home the reality that her brief taste of freedom had been nothing more than a cruel illusion. She looked around the office desperately, searching for some escape route, some ally who might intervene on her behalf. But Mark Stewart had already turned away, unwilling to risk his business for a contract girl he had never cared about. Hannah Clark stood in the doorway, her face pale with fear and helplessness, knowing that any attempt to help would only result in her own destruction. It was then that Martha Hill stepped forward from the shadows near the door, her weathered face set in lines of grim determination. The cook had worked at the Silver Dollar for nearly a decade, earning a reputation for fierce independence and an unwillingness to back down from anyone, regardless of their position or authority. She looked directly at Sheriff Hughes, her eyes flashing with contempt. "Shame on you, Donald Hughes," she said, her voice carrying the moral authority of someone who had watched the town's gradual descent into corruption and greed. "I've known you since you were a mouse pulling pranks behind your father's store, and I never thought I'd see the day when you'd sell your badge to the highest bidder." The sheriff's face flushed red at the accusation, but his gun never wavered from Daniel's chest. "This is official business, Martha. I'd advise you to stay out of it unless you want to join Thompson in jail." Martha's laugh was harsh and bitter, carrying no trace of humor. "Official business? Is that what we're calling it when men like Joyce Gutierrez buy judges and sheriffs to do their dirty work? When young women are sold like cattle to satisfy gambling debts?" She gestured toward Diane with one gnarled hand. "This girl's father sold her to pay for his own weakness, and now you want to hand her over to a man who trades in human misery. What's official about that?" The confrontation in the small office had drawn a crowd of curious onlookers from the saloon below, their faces pressed against the doorway as they witnessed the drama unfolding. Word of Daniel Thompson's arrest was already spreading through Copper Ridge's tight-knit community, carried by whispers and speculation that grew more elaborate with each retelling. Some of the miners who had benefited from the mountain man's occasional interventions on behalf of the weak and defenseless muttered among themselves, their expressions dark with barely contained anger. Stephen Peterson pushed his way through the crowd, his face bearing the marks of a recent fight and his eyes burning with the desire for revenge. He had been waiting for this moment ever since Daniel had humiliated him in front of the entire saloon, and now he saw his opportunity to settle the score. "About time someone put that mountain savage in his place," he called out, his voice slurred with drink but clear in its malice. "Been terrorizing honest folks for too long. Tell us where you're watching from, and show this video some love in the comments to help it reach more people who need to hear this story." Daniel's eyes found Stephen Peterson in the crowd, and for a moment the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. The mountain man's voice, when he spoke, carried the promise of future reckoning. "When these shackles come off, Peterson, you and I will finish what we started." Sheriff Hughes stepped between the two men, his authority the only thing preventing violence from erupting in the crowded space. "That's enough talk from everyone. Thompson, you're coming with me to the jail. Miss Ross, you'll be escorted to more suitable accommodations while the legal matters are sorted out." Diane felt her legs grow weak as the full implications of those words sank in. Suitable accommodations could only mean one thing. She would be held somewhere under Joyce Gutierrez's control while he arranged for new documentation that would bind her to his service. The destruction of the original contract had been a temporary setback, nothing more. Men with enough money and influence could always find ways to get what they wanted, especially when their victims had no resources to fight back. But as the sheriff moved to escort Daniel from the office, Martha Hill stepped directly into his path, her small frame blocking the doorway with surprising effectiveness. Behind her, other members of the Silver Dollar staff began to gather, their faces showing a mixture of fear and determination that spoke to years of accumulated grievances against the corruption that had infected their community. "You're not taking either of them anywhere," Martha declared, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had made an irrevocable decision. "Not until we get some answers about these mysterious warrants and sudden legal proceedings." Sheriff Hughes raised his pistol toward Martha, his face twisted with frustration and growing anger. "Stand aside, old woman, or I'll arrest you for obstruction of justice." The threat hung in the air like smoke from the fireplace, heavy with the promise of violence and the corruption of everything law enforcement was supposed to represent. But Martha Hill had lived through too much hardship and witnessed too much injustice to be intimidated by a badge wielded in service of greed rather than justice. She crossed her arms over her chest and planted her feet more firmly in the doorway. "Justice?" she repeated, her voice dripping with scorn. "Is that what you call it when a young woman is sold like livestock to pay her father's debts? When contracts that violate territorial law are enforced at gunpoint? When judges issue warrants based on the word of men who profit from human suffering?" The crowd behind Martha began to murmur agreement, their voices growing louder and more confident as they realized they were not alone in their outrage. Hannah Clark stepped forward to stand beside Martha, followed by two of the other serving girls, whose own situations were not so different from Diane's. Even some of the miners who had initially seemed supportive of Stephen Peterson began to shift uncomfortably, their sense of rough frontier justice conflicting with what they were witnessing. Joyce Gutierrez's men exchanged nervous glances, clearly unprepared for this level of resistance from what they had assumed would be a compliant population. Their hands moved closer to their weapons, but the growing crowd made the use of force increasingly problematic. Violence in such close quarters would likely result in casualties among innocent bystanders. And even corrupt officials had to consider the political consequences of such actions. Daniel Thompson watched the confrontation unfold with the calculating gaze of a predator, waiting for the right moment to strike. Despite the shackles that bound his wrists, he remained coiled and ready, his eyes never leaving Sheriff Hughes's gun hand. The mountain man had survived years in the wilderness by learning to read the subtle signs that preceded violence, and he could sense the growing tension in the small office like the pressure that built before a thunderstorm. Diane found herself caught between hope and despair as she watched the impromptu rebellion taking shape around her. These people barely knew her, had no particular reason to risk their own safety for a contract girl who would likely be gone from their lives within days. Yet here they stood, facing down armed men and corrupt authority on her behalf. The realization that she was not entirely alone in her struggle brought tears to her eyes, though she fought to keep them from falling. "This is your last warning," Sheriff Hughes said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "Stand aside or face the consequences." Martha Hill's response was to step even closer to the sheriff, her weathered face inches from his own. "The only consequences I'm worried about are the ones that come from standing by while evil men destroy innocent lives. You want to arrest someone? Arrest the men who profit from slavery. Arrest the judges who sell their verdicts to the highest bidder. Arrest yourself for betraying everything that badge is supposed to represent." The accusation struck home with devastating accuracy, and Sheriff Hughes's face went pale beneath his anger. Every person in the room knew that Martha's words contained more truth than comfort, and the sheriff's own conscience, however deeply buried, recognized the justice of her charges. But he had committed himself to a course of action that offered no honorable retreat, and men like Joyce Gutierrez did not tolerate failure from their purchased officials. "I'm done talking," Hughes said, raising his pistol toward Martha's chest. "Move, or I'll move you myself." It was then that Daniel Thompson made his move. Despite the shackles that bound his wrists, years of surviving in the wilderness had given him reflexes that bordered on supernatural. He lunged forward with explosive speed, his shoulder catching Sheriff Hughes in the midsection and driving him backward into the wall. The pistol discharged with a deafening roar, the bullet embedding itself in the ceiling as both men crashed to the floor in a tangle of limbs and fury. The small office erupted into chaos as Joyce Gutierrez's men drew their weapons and the crowd pressed forward with shouts of alarm and encouragement. Martha Hill grabbed Diane's arm and pulled her toward the window, her movements surprisingly quick for a woman of her age. "This way, child," she whispered urgently. "There's a back stair that leads to the alley." But escape was not so simple. One of Gutierrez's men blocked their path to the window, his gun trained on the two women with steady precision. "Nobody leaves until this is sorted out," he said, his voice calm despite the violence erupting around him. "Mr. Gutierrez has invested considerable time and money in this arrangement, and he expects a return on his investment." On the floor, Daniel and Sheriff Hughes continued their desperate struggle, the mountain man's shackled hands putting him at a severe disadvantage despite his superior strength and fighting skills. Hughes managed to wrap his arm around Daniel's throat, applying pressure that threatened to cut off his air supply. But the sheriff had underestimated both his opponent's endurance and his willingness to fight dirty when necessary. Daniel drove his elbow backward into Hughes's ribs, the impact accompanied by the sharp crack of breaking bone. The sheriff's grip loosened, and Daniel rolled away, gasping for breath, but still dangerous despite his restraints. He came to his feet with the fluid grace of a wild animal, his eyes blazing with primal fury as he faced the remaining threats in the room. The other two of Gutierrez's men had their weapons drawn and pointed at various members of the crowd, creating a tense standoff that could explode into violence at any moment. The confined space of the office made accurate shooting difficult, but it also meant that any gunfire would likely result in multiple casualties. Everyone in the room understood this deadly mathematics, and for a long moment, nobody moved. It was Diane who broke the stalemate. Seeing Daniel bleeding from a cut on his forehead and Martha Hill trembling with exhaustion and fear, she felt something shift inside her chest like the breaking of a dam. For months, she had been passive, accepting whatever fate others imposed upon her, allowing herself to be bought and sold like property. But watching these people risk their lives for her freedom awakened something that had been dormant since her mother's death, the will to fight back. "Stop," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Every eye in the room turned toward her as she stepped forward, placing herself between the armed men and the crowd of defenders. "This has gone far enough. People are going to get hurt, and it's all because of me." Joyce Gutierrez's man smiled coldly, interpreting her words as surrender. "Smart girl. Now come along quietly, and nobody else needs to get shot." But Diane was not surrendering. Instead, she was making a calculation of her own, weighing the value of her freedom against the lives of people who had shown her more kindnesses in one evening than she had received in months of servitude. The mathematics of that equation were clear, even if the emotional cost was almost unbearable. "I'll come with you," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that threatened to choke her. "But only if you let everyone else go. No arrests, no charges, no retaliation against anyone in this room." Daniel's voice cut through the air like a whip crack. "No." The single word carried such force and authority that even the armed men hesitated. Despite his shackles and the blood running down his face, the mountain man radiated a dangerous energy that made everyone in the room acutely aware of their mortality. "She's not going anywhere with these men." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, every person in the room balanced on the knife's edge between life and death. Sheriff Hughes struggled to his feet, one hand pressed against his broken ribs, his face twisted with pain and humiliation. The pistol lay on the floor where it had fallen during the struggle, but he made no move to retrieve it, perhaps recognizing that his authority had been irretrievably damaged by the night's events. Outside, the wind howled through Copper Ridge's narrow streets, carrying with it the promise of a blizzard that would trap everyone in the town for days or possibly weeks. The isolation that the storm would bring added another layer of urgency to the confrontation, as everyone understood that whatever happened in this room would determine the balance of power in the community for the foreseeable future. Martha Hill stepped closer to Diane, her weathered hand finding the young woman's arm and squeezing gently. "You don't have to sacrifice yourself for us, child," she whispered. "We knew the risks when we decided to stand up to these men." But Diane shook her head, her decision made despite the cost it would exact from her soul. "You've already done more for me than anyone has in years. I won't let you pay the price for my freedom." It was then that Hannah Clark spoke up from her position near the doorway, her voice carrying a strength that surprised everyone who knew her. "There's something you all should know about Joyce Gutierrez and his business arrangements. Something that might change how the situation gets resolved." All eyes turned toward the auburn-haired woman who had been Diane's only friend during her months at the Silver Dollar. Hannah's face was pale but determined, as if she had finally decided to reveal a secret that had been eating away at her for months or perhaps years. "I worked for Gutierrez before I came to Copper Ridge," she continued, her words falling into the tense silence like stones into still water. "In Denver, at one of his establishments. I know how he operates, and I know what happens to girls who get caught up in his web. Joyce Gutierrez's men exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly unhappy with this development. Their employer's reputation was built on a careful balance of legitimate business activities and darker enterprises that existed in the shadows of territorial law. Public discussion of his methods could prove problematic, especially in front of witnesses who might later testify before territorial authorities. "Hannah, don't," one of them warned, his voice carrying an implicit threat. Mr. Gutierrez doesn't appreciate former employees discussing his private affairs. But Hannah had passed the point of caring about threats from men who had already taken so much from her. "The contracts he uses aren't just illegal because of territorial law," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "They're part of a larger operation that involves territorial officials, judges, and law enforcement officers throughout Colorado. Girls are bought and sold like cattle, moved from town to town, and anyone who tries to help them disappears." The revelation hit the room like a physical blow, recontextualizing everything that had happened that evening. This was not simply a dispute over a single contract or the fate of one young woman. It was part of a systematic corruption that reached into the highest levels of territorial government, a network of exploitation that depended on the silence and complicity of local communities. Daniel Thompson's eyes narrowed as he processed the implications of Hannah's words. His years in the wilderness had brought him into contact with territorial marshals and federal officials who had hinted at larger patterns of corruption in Colorado's mining regions. The mountain man had always avoided involvement in politics, preferring the honest dangers of nature to the more complex threats posed by human greed and ambition. But the situation had moved beyond his ability to remain neutral. "Names," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Give us names, Hannah. Who else is involved in this operation?" Hannah glanced nervously at Gutierrez's men, but Martha Hill's encouraging nod gave her the courage to continue. "Judge Martha Hill isn't the only one on their payroll. There's Judge Robert Wilson in Denver, Sheriff Thomas Anderson in Boulder, and at least a dozen other officials throughout the territory. They move girls through a network of establishments, always keeping them isolated and dependent." The list of names sent a chill through the room as people recognized the scope of the conspiracy they were confronting. These were not simply local criminals taking advantage of desperate situations. They were part of an organized system that had corrupted the very foundations of law and order in the territory. Fighting such a network would require more than individual courage. It would demand a coordinated effort that could reach beyond the boundaries of any single community. Sheriff Hughes, still clutching his broken ribs, looked around the room with growing desperation. His involvement with Joyce Gutierrez had seemed like a simple matter of supplementing his meager salary with occasional favors for a wealthy businessman. He had never fully understood the extent of the operation he had become part of, and the revelation of its true scope filled him with a terror that went beyond physical fear. "This is all speculation and lies," he said, his voice lacking conviction. "Hannah Clark is a known prostitute with a grudge against respectable businessmen. Her testimony wouldn't hold up in any court." But his words rang hollow in the face of the evidence that surrounded them. The very fact that armed men had appeared within hours of Daniel's intervention, backed by hastily issued warrants and legal documents, suggested a level of organization and preparation that went far beyond normal law enforcement procedures. The corruption was so obvious that even those who benefited from it could no longer deny its existence. Daniel looked directly at Sheriff Hughes, his winter sky eyes boring into the man's soul with uncomfortable intensity. "The question now is what you're going to do about it, Hughes. Are you going to continue serving men who profit from slavery? Or are you going to remember what that badge is supposed to represent?" The challenge hung in the air between them, offering the sheriff a chance at redemption that might be his last. Around the room, the crowd waited with held breath to see which path he would choose. Outside, the wind continued to howl, and the first heavy snowflakes began to fall, sealing Copper Ridge off from the outside world and forcing everyone present to confront the consequences of their choices without the possibility of escape or outside intervention. Joyce Gutierrez's men were growing increasingly agitated as they realized that their simple prisoner retrieval had become something far more complex and dangerous. The revelation of their employer's broader operations had transformed them from law enforcement officers into conspirators in a criminal enterprise, and the witnesses in the room represented a threat that could not be easily eliminated. "We're leaving," the leader of the group announced, his hand tightening on his weapon, "and we're taking the girl with us. Anyone who tries to interfere will be shot." But as he spoke, the sound of footsteps echoed from the stairway leading up from the saloon below. So, heavy boots on wooden steps, accompanied by the low murmur of voices and the metallic click of weapons being readied. The confrontation in Mark Stewart's office had drawn the attention of every person in the Silver Dollar, and many of them were now making their way upstairs to see how the situation would be resolved. The arrival of additional witnesses and potential combatants changed the dynamics of the standoff once again. Joyce Gutierrez's men found themselves outnumbered and surrounded, their escape routes blocked by a growing crowd of miners, drifters, and townspeople who had decided that they had seen enough corruption and injustice for one lifetime. The small office that had seemed cramped with half a dozen people now felt impossibly crowded as more bodies pressed into the available space. Stephen Peterson pushed his way through the crowd, his face flushed with alcohol and excitement. He had been looking forward to seeing Daniel Thompson humiliated and arrested, but the evening's developments had taken an unexpected turn that threatened to rob him of his anticipated revenge. "What's all this talk about corruption and criminal enterprises?" he demanded, his voice slurred but loud enough to carry throughout the room. "These are respectable businessmen conducting legal affairs." His words were met with derisive laughter from several members of the crowd, including miners who had personal experience with the kind of legal affairs that involved armed men and hastily issued warrants. The frontier had taught these men to recognize predators in all their forms, and they had no difficulty identifying the true nature of Joyce Gutierrez's business arrangements. "Respectable businessmen don't need 3 armed guards to collect on a contract dispute," called out one of the miners, a grizzled veteran of Colorado's gold rush who had seen his share of claim jumpers and confidence men. "And they don't buy judges and sheriffs to do their dirty work." The comment drew murmurs of agreement from throughout the crowd, and Stephen Peterson found himself increasingly isolated in his support for the forces of corruption that had invaded their community. His own reputation for violence and intimidation had made him few friends among the honest residents of Copper Ridge, and his association with the Joyce Gutierrez's men marked him as a collaborator in their eyes. Daniel Thompson sensed the shifting mood of the crowd and recognized an opportunity to turn the situation to his advantage. Despite the shackles that still bound his wrists, he commanded respect and attention from the assembled miners and townspeople. His reputation as a man who lived by his own code and answered to no authority but his own conscience had earned him a grudging admiration even from those who found his lifestyle incomprehensible. "Listen to me," he said, his voice cutting through the babble of conversation and argument that filled the cramped office. "What we're dealing with here isn't just about one young woman or one corrupt contract. It's about whether we're going to let our community be turned into a marketplace for human slavery." The words hit their target with devastating accuracy, reducing the room to absolute silence as everyone contemplated the implications of what he had said. The frontier had attracted many people who were fleeing various forms of oppression and seeking the opportunity to build new lives based on their own efforts and choices. The idea that those freedoms could be systematically undermined by organized corruption struck at the heart of everything they had come west to find. "Hannah Clark has given us names and details about a criminal network that reaches into the highest levels of territorial government," Daniel continued, his eyes moving from face to face in the crowd. "We can choose to ignore that information and let these men take Diane Ross to a fate we all know she doesn't deserve. Or we can decide that some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds are stacked against us." The mountain man's words resonated through the room like the tolling of a bell, calling each person present to make a choice that would define not only their own character, but the future of their community. Some of the faces in the crowd showed fear and uncertainty, while others reflected a growing determination to stand up against forces that had gone unchallenged for too long. Martha Hill stepped forward once again, her small frame somehow commanding attention despite being surrounded by much larger men. "Daniel Thompson is right," she declared, her voice carrying the moral authority of someone who had spent decades watching the gradual erosion of decency and justice in frontier communities. If we let these men take Diane tonight, how long before they come for someone else? How long before every young woman in Copper Ridge is at risk of being sold to pay someone else's debts? Her questions hung in the air like an indictment, forcing everyone present to confront the logical consequences of inaction. The crowd began to murmur among themselves, individual conversations merging into a growing consensus that something had to be done to resist the forces that threatened their community's independence and moral foundation. Joyce Gutierrez's men were clearly becoming desperate as they realized that their simple prisoner retrieval had evolved into something approaching a popular uprising. The leader of the group made a decision that would prove to be a critical mistake, raising his weapon and pointing it directly at Martha Hill's chest. "That's enough talk from all of you," he snarled, his composure finally cracking under the pressure of the situation. "We came here to collect property that belongs to our employer, and we're not leaving without it. Anyone who gets in our way will be treated as an enemy of lawful authority." The threat was intended to cow the crowd into submission, but it had exactly the opposite effect. The sight of an armed stranger threatening a respected member of their community crystallized the anger and resentment that had been building throughout the evening. Several of the miners moved forward with expressions of barely contained fury, their hands moving toward knives and other weapons they carried as tools of their dangerous trade. "Lawful authority?" one of them spat, his voice thick with contempt. "You mean the kind of authority that can be bought and sold like everything else? The kind that serves rich men who profit from misery and calls it justice?" The confrontation had reached a tipping point where violence seemed inevitable, but it was Diane Ross who once again stepped forward to prevent bloodshed. Despite everything that had happened, despite the revelation of the larger criminal conspiracy and the growing support from the community, she could not bear the thought of people dying because of her situation. "Please," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade, "this has to stop before someone gets killed. I'll go with them willingly if it means ending this standoff." Her offer drew immediate protests from Daniel, Martha, Hannah, and several others in the crowd, but Diane held up her hand for silence. "You've all done more for me tonight than I had any right to expect," she continued, tears streaming down her face despite her efforts to remain strong. "But I won't have your blood on my hands. Some prices are too high to pay, even for freedom." The nobility of her sacrifice was not lost on anyone in the room, but it also served to highlight the fundamental injustice of the situation they were confronting. Here was a young woman willing to condemn herself to a life of exploitation and abuse in order to protect people who had shown her kindness, while the men who would profit from her suffering hid behind the facade of legal authority and business respectability. Daniel Thompson's response was swift and uncompromising. "No," he said, the single word carrying such force that even Joyce Gutierrez's armed men hesitated. "You're not going anywhere with these men." "Diane, oh, not tonight, not ever." The mountain man turned his attention to Sheriff Hughes, who had been watching the proceedings with growing horror as he realized the full extent of the corruption he had become part of. "Hughes, you have a choice to make right now. You can continue serving men who buy and sell human beings, or you can remember what it means to be a peace officer in a community that deserves better." Sheriff Hughes looked around the room at the faces of people he had known for years, seeing in their expressions a mixture of disappointment, anger, and fading hope that he might yet choose to do the right thing. The weight of their judgment pressed down on him like a physical burden, forcing him to confront the reality of what he had become and what he might still choose to be. "The warrants," he said finally, his voice barely audible above the wind that howled outside the building. "The warrants were issued based on false information. Joyce Gutierrez paid Judge Martha Hill to sign documents that had no legal foundation." The admission sent a shockwave through the room as the sheriff's words confirmed what many had suspected, but none had been able to prove. The revelation that a sitting judge had been bought and paid for by criminal interests represented a level of corruption that threatened the very foundations of territorial law and order. Joyce Gutierrez's men realized that their situation had become untenable. The sheriff's confession had stripped away their legal justification for being in Copper Ridge, and the growing hostility of the crowd made their position increasingly dangerous. But they also understood that returning to their employer empty-handed would likely result in consequences that were worse than whatever they might face from an angry mob. The leader of the group made one final attempt to salvage his mission, grabbing Diane's arm and pulling her toward him with brutal force. "Legal or not, she's coming with us," he declared, pressing the barrel of his gun against her temple. "Anyone who tries to stop us will watch her die first." The threat transformed the tense standoff into a life-or-death crisis, with Diane's survival hanging in the balance of decisions that would be made in the next few seconds. The crowd pressed forward with angry shouts, but the gun at Diane's head kept them from taking direct action. Daniel strained against his shackles with desperate fury, knowing that his inability to act might cost the life of the woman he had tried to save. But it was Sheriff Hughes who ultimately determined the outcome of the confrontation. Drawing his backup pistol with surprising speed, he pointed it at Joyce Gutierrez's man and spoke with the authority of someone who had finally remembered what his badge was supposed to represent. "Let her go," he commanded, his voice steady despite the broken ribs that made every breath painful. "You're under arrest for kidnapping, extortion, and conspiracy to commit human trafficking. Drop your weapon and step away from the girl." The moment stretched like a taut wire as everyone in the room waited to see how the final confrontation would resolve itself. Outside, the blizzard continued to build, sealing Copper Ridge off from the outside world and ensuring that whatever happened in Mark Stewart's office would determine the fate of everyone present. The wind howled like the voices of the damned, and the future hung in the balance of a single trigger pull. The moment stretched like a taut wire as Joyce Gutierrez's man pressed the gun barrel harder against Diane's temple, his eyes darting between Sheriff Hughes's weapon and the hostile faces surrounding him. The wind outside had grown to a howling fury, rattling the windows of the Silver Dollar and reminding everyone that the blizzard would trap them all together until nature decided otherwise. In the cramped office above the saloon, the future of Copper Ridge balanced on the edge of a single decision. "You think I won't do it?" the gunman snarled at Sheriff Hughes, his voice cracking under the pressure of a situation that had spiraled far beyond his control. "Mr. Gutierrez don't accept failure, and I ain't going back to Denver empty-handed." Sheriff Hughes kept his pistol trained on the man's chest, his broken ribs sending waves of pain through his body with each breath. But something had changed in the lawman's bearing, a transformation that went deeper than physical injury or professional humiliation. The weight of his badge, which had become a burden of corruption and compromise, now felt like what it was always meant to be, a symbol of protection for those who could not protect themselves. "Then you're going to die in this room," Hughes said quietly, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of a man who had finally chosen his side. "Because I'm not letting you take her." The crowd pressed closer despite the danger, their anger at months and years of accumulated injustice finally finding a focus. Daniel Thompson strained against his shackles with desperate fury, the metal cutting into his wrists as he fought to reach Diane. Martha Hill stood at the front of the group, her weathered face set in lines of grim determination that spoke to decades of watching evil triumph while good people remained silent. It was Hannah Clark who broke the deadlock. Moving with the quiet grace of someone who had learned to navigate dangerous situations, she slipped through the crowd until she stood directly behind Joyce Gutierrez's second man. Her hand found the knife she kept hidden in her skirts, a blade that had protected her through years of working in establishments where women's safety was never guaranteed. "Let her go," Hannah said, her voice carrying a strength that surprised everyone who knew her. "Or I'll open your friend's throat before you can pull that trigger." The second gunman felt the steel pressing against his neck and froze, understanding that his situation had become untenable. His companion holding Diane realized that their tactical advantage had evaporated, leaving them surrounded and outnumbered with no clear path to escape. The careful plan that Joyce Gutierrez had orchestrated was crumbling in the face of a community that had finally decided to fight back. "This ain't over," the lead gunman said, but his voice lacked conviction as he slowly lowered his weapon from Diane's head. "Mr. Gutierrez has reach you can't imagine. Judges, marshals, territorial officials. He'll destroy this whole town if necessary." Daniel Thompson's laugh was harsh and bitter, carrying no trace of humor. "Let him try. This territory is bigger than his corruption, and there are still men who remember what justice looks like. The gunman released Diane, who stumbled forward into Martha Hill's protective embrace. The older woman's arms wrapped around her like a shield against the forces that had sought to destroy her, and for the first time in months, Diane felt truly safe. The tears she had been holding back finally came, washing away the fear and desperation that had been her constant companions since her father had sold her to pay his gambling debts. Sheriff Hughes moved quickly to disarm both men, his movements careful but determined despite his injuries. The crowd parted to allow him access, their expressions showing a mixture of surprise and cautious approval at his transformation from corrupt official to protector of justice. The shackles that bound Daniel's wrists were quickly removed, the mountain man rubbing the circulation back into his hands while keeping his eyes fixed on the defeated gunman. "What happens now?" Mark Stewart asked from behind his desk, his voice carrying the nervous uncertainty of a man who had profited from the corruption that was now being dismantled around him. The saloon owner understood that the events of this night would have consequences that reached far beyond his establishment, and he was already calculating how to position himself on the winning side. Daniel looked around the room at the faces of people who had risked everything to stand up for what was right, his winter sky eyes reflecting something that might have been hope. "Now we make sure this never happens again. Hannah has given us names and details about Gutierrez's operation. That information needs to reach territorial authorities who aren't on his payroll." "And how do we know who to trust?" Martha Hill asked, her practical mind already working through the challenges they would face in fighting a corruption network that reached into the highest levels of government. It was Sheriff Hughes who answered, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had intimate knowledge of the system they were confronting. "There's a federal marshal named Patricia Davis who's been investigating territorial corruption for months. She's clean, and she has the authority to act on the information Hannah can provide." The mention of federal involvement sent a ripple of hope through the room, but it also highlighted the dangers they would face in the coming weeks and months. Joyce Gutierrez and his associates would not simply accept defeat, and their resources for retaliation were considerable. Everyone who had participated in the Knights' Rebellion understood that they had painted targets on their backs. "We'll need to stick together," Daniel said, his gaze moving from face to face in the crowd. "Gutierrez will try to pick us off one by one if we scatter. But if we stand united, if we watch each other's backs, we can survive whatever he throws at us." The mountain man's words carried the weight of experience earned through years of surviving in hostile territory, and the assembled crowd recognized the wisdom in his counsel. Plans began to form for organizing watches, sharing information, and providing mutual protection against the retaliation that was sure to come. Outside, the blizzard continued to build, but the howling wind no longer seemed like a harbinger of doom. Instead, it had become a barrier that would give them time to prepare, time to organize, time to transform their moment of defiance into something more permanent and powerful. The isolation that had once trapped them in cycles of corruption and despair now offered an opportunity to build something better. Diane found herself standing beside Daniel Thompson as the crowd began to disperse, making plans for the morning and the challenges that lay ahead. The mountain man's presence beside her felt solid and reassuring, an anchor of strength in a world that had suddenly become full of possibilities rather than limitations. When he looked down at her, she saw in his eyes the same recognition that had passed between them during their first encounter in the saloon weeks earlier. "You don't have to go back to the high country alone," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the wind that rattled the windows. "If the offer of help with the trap lines still stands." Daniel's smile was small but genuine, transforming his weathered features and revealing the gentleness that lay beneath his intimidating exterior. "It stands, but you should know that life in the mountains isn't easy. The winters are long and cold, and the nearest neighbor is a day's ride away." Diane looked around the room at the people who had risked their lives for her freedom, at the faces that showed determination rather than defeat despite the challenges they faced. "Easy isn't what I'm looking for," she replied. "I'm looking for a life where I make my own choices, where my value isn't determined by someone else's debts or desires." The conversation was interrupted by Hannah Clark, who approached them with an expression of nervous determination. In her hands, she carried a small leather journal that looked worn from years of use. This contains everything I know about Gutierrez's operation, she said, offering the book to Daniel. Names, locations, methods, financial arrangements, everything I witnessed during my time working for him. Daniel accepted the journal with the reverence due to a sacred text, or understanding that the information it contained could be the key to dismantling a network of corruption that had destroyed countless lives. This must have taken considerable courage to compile, he observed. Hannah's laugh was bitter but not without hope. Courage had nothing to do with it. I kept records because I knew that someday I'd need leverage to escape. I just never thought I'd be using them to help bring down the whole operation. The three of them were joined by Martha Hill, who had been organizing the other women to ensure their safety during the difficult days ahead. The older woman's face showed the satisfaction of someone who had finally seen justice prevail after years of watching evil triumph through inaction and fear. The girls will stay together at my boarding house, she announced. We'll look out for each other and make sure nobody disappears in the night. Hannah's information is too valuable to risk losing to Gutierrez's revenge. Sheriff Hughes approached their group, moving carefully due to his broken ribs, but with purpose in his step. In his hands, he carried the shackles that had bound Daniel, as well as the weapons taken from Joyce Gutierrez's men. I'll be riding out as soon as the storm breaks to contact Marshal Davis, he said. These men will be held in the jail until she arrives, and I'll make sure she gets Hannah's journal, along with my own testimony about the corruption I've witnessed. The transformation in the sheriff was remarkable to witness. The broken, compromised man who had entered Mark Stewart's office with illegal warrants had been replaced by someone who remembered what it meant to serve justice rather than the highest bidder. The change gave hope that others caught up in Gutierrez's web might also find the courage to break free. What about the judge who signed the warrants? Diane asked, thinking of the woman whose corruption had nearly sealed her fate. Judge Martha Hill will face federal charges along with the others, Hughes replied. Her involvement in this conspiracy goes back years, and Marshal Davis has been building a case against her for months. Tonight's events will provide the final evidence needed to bring her to trial. The irony was not lost on anyone that the judge shared a name with the woman who had done so much to expose the corruption. But Martha Hill, the cook, simply smiled grimly at the coincidence, understanding that justice sometimes worked in mysterious ways. As the immediate crisis passed and people began to make plans for the future, Diane found herself thinking about her father and the gambling debts that had started this entire ordeal. Wayne Peterson's weakness had set in motion a chain of events that had nearly destroyed her, but it had also led to discoveries about herself that she might never have made otherwise. She had learned that she was stronger than she had ever imagined, that she was worthy of protection and respect, and that freedom was something worth fighting for regardless of the cost. Do you think he knew? She asked Daniel as they stood together near the window, watching the snow pile up in the streets below. My father, I mean. Do you think he understood what he was really selling me into? Daniel considered the question carefully before answering, his experience with human nature tempered by years of observing both the cruelty and kindness that people were capable of displaying. I think he knew it was wrong, he said finally, but desperate people convince themselves that wrong choices are necessary choices. That doesn't excuse what he did, but it might explain it. The answer offered neither absolution nor condemnation for Wayne Peterson, but rather an acknowledgement of the complex motivations that drove people to make choices they would never have considered under different circumstances. Diane found a measure of peace in that understanding, not forgiveness exactly, but a recognition that her father's weakness did not define her own strength. The blizzard raged through the night, sealing Copper Ridge off from the outside world and giving the community time to process the dramatic changes that had taken place. By morning, the snow had piled so high against the buildings that doors could barely be opened, and the mountain passes would remain impassable for days. But the isolation no longer felt like a trap. Instead, it had become a cocoon within which something new and better could take shape. When the storm finally broke 3 days later, Sheriff Hughes departed for Denver with Hannah's journal and a detailed account of the night's events. Joyce Gutierrez's men remained locked in the jail, their employer's network of corruption no longer sufficient to secure their release. Word of what had happened in Copper Ridge began to spread throughout the territory, carried by travelers and traders who understood the significance of a community standing up to organized crime. The response from territorial authorities was swift and decisive. Marshal Patricia Davis arrived within a week, accompanied by federal agents who had been investigating corruption throughout Colorado's mining regions. The evidence provided by Hannah Clark and corroborated by Sheriff Hughes was more than sufficient to begin dismantling Joyce Gutierrez's operation, and arrests began immediately in Denver and other cities where his influence had taken root. Judge Martha Hill was among the first to be taken into custody, her judicial robes providing no protection against federal charges of conspiracy, bribery, and human trafficking. The warrants she had signed based on false information were declared void, and several other cases involving forced labor contracts were reopened for investigation. Joyce Gutierrez himself proved more elusive, disappearing from Denver before the federal agents could locate him. But his network of establishments was shut down, and the women who had been trapped in his system were freed to make their own choices about their futures. Some chose to return to their families, while others decided to start fresh in new territories where their pasts could not follow them. In Copper Ridge, life began to settle into new patterns shaped by the events of that snowy night. Mark Stewart found himself under increased scrutiny from both federal authorities and his own community, forcing him to operate the silver dollar within the bounds of actual law rather than the flexible arrangements he had previously enjoyed. The saloon remained open, but its atmosphere changed as word spread that it was no longer a place where women could be exploited with impunity. Martha Hill's boarding house became a refuge for women seeking to escape difficult situations. Her reputation for fierce protection, drawing those who needed a safe place to rebuild their lives. Hannah Clark became her assistant in this work, using her knowledge of Gutierrez's network to help identify and rescue other victims who might otherwise have remained trapped. Sheriff Hughes underwent a transformation that amazed those who had known him during his years of corruption. The broken ribs from his fight with Daniel Thompson healed, but the changes to his character ran much deeper. He began working closely with federal authorities to identify and prosecute other instances of territorial corruption, his insider knowledge proving invaluable in cases that might otherwise have been impossible to crack. Stephen Peterson found himself increasingly isolated as the community's tolerance for his brand of violence and intimidation evaporated. The miners who had once feared his reputation began to stand up to him, emboldened by the example of collective action they had witnessed. Eventually, he left Copper Ridge entirely, seeking opportunities in territories where his past was unknown and his methods might still find acceptance. For Diane Ross, the weeks following her liberation brought challenges she had not anticipated. Freedom, she discovered, was not simply the absence of constraints, but the presence of choices that required courage to make. The option of remaining in Copper Ridge existed, surrounded by people who had proven their willingness to protect her. But the mountains that loomed beyond the town's boundaries called to something deep within her soul, promising a life shaped by her own decisions rather than the expectations of others. Daniel Thompson made no attempt to pressure her decision, understanding that true freedom required the ability to choose one's own path without coercion. He continued to visit Copper Ridge periodically, trading furs and supplies while maintaining his solitary existence in the high country. But Diane noticed that his visits became more frequent, and his eyes sought her out across the crowded saloon with increasing regularity. The decision, when it finally came, surprised no one who had witnessed her transformation from frightened contract girl to confident young woman. On a clear morning in early spring, as the snow began to melt from the mountain peaks and the first wildflowers pushed through the warming earth, Diane packed her few possessions and prepared to leave Copper Ridge behind. Martha Hill embraced her at the door of the boarding house, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks as she bid farewell to the young woman who had become like a daughter to her. "You remember that you always have a home here," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "No matter what happens up in those mountains, no matter how hard life gets, you can always come back." Hannah Clark pressed a small package into Diane's hands, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. "Something to remember us by," she said simply. Inside the package, Diane found a silver locket that had belonged to Hannah's mother, along with a letter expressing hopes for happiness and freedom that both women had thought impossible only months before. The entire community turned out to see her off, their faces showing a mixture of sadness at her departure and pride in the strength she had displayed. These people had risked their lives for her freedom, and now they were demonstrating their respect for her right to use that freedom as she saw fit. Daniel Thompson waited at the edge of town with 2 horses and supplies for the journey into the high country. His pack animals carried everything needed for an extended stay in the wilderness. But Diane noticed that he had also brought items that suggested a more permanent arrangement: tools for building, seeds for planting, and materials for crafts that would help pass the long winter evenings. As they rode away from Copper Ridge, following a trail that wound upward through pine forests and across crystal-clear streams, Diane felt the last of her fears falling away like discarded chains. The mountains that had once seemed forbidding now welcomed her with their promise of solitude and self-determination. Behind her lay a community that had been transformed by its willingness to stand up for justice, while ahead stretched a future limited only by her own courage and imagination. The cabin that Daniel had built in a high meadow surrounded by towering peaks was everything Diane had imagined and more. Constructed from logs hewn by his own hands and chinked with moss and clay, it represented the kind of self-sufficiency that she had dreamed of during her months of servitude. A clear stream ran nearby, providing fresh water and the music of flowing current, while the meadow itself was carpeted with wildflowers that painted the landscape in brilliant colors. "It's not much," Daniel said as they approached the simple structure, his voice carrying the uncertainty of a man unaccustomed to sharing his private sanctuary. Diane dismounted from her horse and walked slowly around the cabin, taking in the careful craftsmanship that spoke to years of patient labor. The logs were perfectly fitted, the roof was tight against weather, and the windows were positioned to capture the maximum amount of natural light. A garden plot had been prepared behind the cabin, ready for planting, and a small barn provided shelter for the animals. "It's perfect," she said, and meant it. The cabin represented everything that Mark Stewart's saloon and Joyce Gutierrez's establishments were not: honest work, self-determination, and the freedom to live according to one's own values rather than the demands of others. The first months in the high country tested Diane in ways she had never imagined. The physical demands of mountain life were considerable, from hauling water and chopping wood to helping with the trap lines that provided their primary source of income. Her hands, soft from months of serving drinks, became calloused and strong from handling tools and working with rough materials. But the challenges were matched by rewards that money could never buy. The silence of the mountains, broken only by the calls of eagles and the whisper of wind through pine trees, provided a peace that healed wounds she had not even realized she carried. The sight of elk grazing in the meadow at dawn, the brilliant display of stars visible in the unpolluted night sky, and the simple satisfaction of work that served her own purposes rather than someone else's profit created a contentment she had never known was possible. Daniel proved to be a patient teacher, sharing the skills he had learned through years of solitary survival. He showed her how to read weather signs and the behavior of animals and the color of distant clouds, how to preserve meat and vegetables for the long winter months, and how to move through the wilderness without disturbing its delicate balance. More importantly, he demonstrated through his actions that respect and partnership were possible between a man and woman, even in the isolation of the high country. Their relationship developed slowly, built on shared work and mutual respect rather than the desperate circumstances that had brought them together. Diane learned that Daniel's choice to live alone had not been born of misanthropy, but of disappointment with a world that too often rewarded cruelty and punished kindness. Her presence in his carefully ordered existence represented not an intrusion, but a completion, filling spaces in his life that he had not realized were empty. As autumn approached and the first snow began to dust the highest peaks, word reached them through occasional visitors that the trials resulting from their night of rebellion in Copper Ridge were proceeding successfully. Joyce Gutierrez had been captured in California and extradited to face federal charges, while his network of corrupt officials was being systematically dismantled throughout the territory. Judge Martha Hill had been sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. Her judicial career ended in disgrace and her ill-gotten wealth confiscated to compensate victims of the trafficking network she had supported. Sheriff Hughes had been commended by territorial authorities for his cooperation in the investigation and had been appointed to a position with the Federal Marshal Service, his transformation from corrupt official to champion of justice complete. The news brought satisfaction, but little surprise to Dan and Daniel. They had witnessed firsthand the power of people standing together against injustice, and they understood that their individual act of defiance had been part of a larger pattern of resistance that was reshaping the territory's approach to law and order. But perhaps the most meaningful news came in a letter from Martha Hill, written in her careful script and delivered by a trader who made the dangerous journey into the high country specifically to bring it to them. The boarding house continued to serve as a refuge for women escaping difficult situations, and several of the girls who had worked at the Silver Dollar had found new lives and meaningful work in other communities. Hannah Clark had married a widowed rancher from outside Copper Ridge, a man who valued her courage and intelligence more than her past. Their wedding had been celebrated by the entire community, a symbol of hope and new beginnings that inspired others to believe in the possibility of redemption and fresh starts. Most importantly, the letter contained news that a school had been established in Copper Ridge, funded by money confiscated from Joyce Gutierrez's criminal enterprises. Young women who might otherwise have faced limited options now had access to education and training that would allow them to support themselves through honest work rather than exploitation. As winter settled over the high country with its blanket of snow and months of isolation, Diane found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her from her father's cramped parlor to this mountain sanctuary. The girl who had signed that illegal contract that had been motivated by desperation and fear, willing to accept any fate that promised survival. The woman who now shared the mountain cabin had learned that survival was not enough, that life without dignity and self-determination was merely existence. The long winter evenings provided time for conversation and planning that deepened their partnership beyond the practical necessities of mountain survival. Daniel shared stories of his years in the wilderness, the experiences that had shaped his understanding of independence and self-reliance. Diane spoke of her dreams for the future, possibilities that extended beyond mere escape from the bushes to encompass active participation in building something better. They made plans for expanding the garden in the coming spring, for building additional structures that would allow them to be more self-sufficient, and for perhaps taking in others who might need the sanctuary that the mountains provided. The isolation that had once seemed like exile now felt like freedom, an opportunity to create a life based on their own values rather than the corrupted systems they had left behind. Spring arrived with a rush of melting snow and the return of wildlife to the high meadows. As Diane worked in the expanded garden, planting seeds that would provide food for the coming year, she thought about the contract that Daniel had torn in half and thrown into Mark Stewart's fireplace. That document had attempted to define her worth in terms of her father's debts and her usefulness to men who profited from exploitation. But the true contract that governed her life now was written not on paper, but in the daily choices she made, the work she performed with her own hands, and the respect she had earned through her courage and determination. It was a contract with herself, promising that she would never again allow others to determine her value or dictate her future. The mountains that surrounded their meadow stood as silent witnesses to this transformation, their peaks crowned with snow that caught the morning light like promises of endless possibility. In their shadow, Diane Ross had found not just freedom from the forces that had sought to destroy her, but freedom to become the person she was always meant to be. Daniel emerged from the cabin as the sun crested the eastern peaks, his presence beside her as natural as the mountain air they breathed. Together, they watched the light spread across their valley, illuminating a future that belonged entirely to them. The contract that truly mattered required no signatures, no witnesses, and no legal enforcement. It was written in the language of mutual respect, shared purpose, and the unshakable conviction that every human being deserved the right to choose their own destiny. In the distance, an eagle soared above the peaks, its cry echoing across the wilderness like a celebration of freedom itself. And in that moment, surrounded by the majesty of the mountains and the promise of another day shaped by their own choices, Diane Ross understood that she had finally come home.